Alrighty, welcome everyone. This is my first time doing a session like this, so please let me know if you can't hear me. Give me a heads up, shout, a visual signal, everything will be fine. So welcome to how NatWest uses AWS services to manage vulnerabilities at scale. My name is Gal Ordo. I'm the product manager for Security Hub. Together with me will be speaking my colleague Greg Wilson from AWS and my dear friend Kenny from NatWest. So how about we get started? I'll give us a brief introduction about vulnerabilities in the cloud, what they actually mean, how we suggest to monitor them using AWS tools, and what are the right tools to be using to do that. And from there, you'll hear from Kenny and Greg. But really the way that my team and myself think about vulnerabilities in the cloud or vulnerabilities in general, the metaphor that we use is that it's as if you leave the door to your house open. Nothing bad has happened yet. No one has come in and started to look through your things and steal them and so on. But the second someone realizes that the door is open, something very bad can happen. And this is really how we think about vulnerabilities. A sort of a door before a breach or an active threat actually happen. And when we look at vulnerabilities in the cloud, there are a lot of different types, but we are actually focusing on three main types. The first type is what we call misconfigurations or configuration vulnerabilities. And this is the case of cloud resources that are not configured securely. For example, don't have the encryption set on the API level, or for example, in the case of an EC2 instance, using an older version of IMDS, the instance metadata version. A second type of vulnerabilities that we are looking at is software vulnerabilities. Use of software packages, normally from third parties, that have security flaws. This is normally what translates into a CVE that are then published by organizations that look for vulnerabilities once a vulnerability is found. The third type of vulnerabilities that we are looking at is code vulnerabilities, a vulnerability or a logical flaw in a code that you yourselves actually write. And this is, this can be a case of allowing any external IP to talk with your application instead of just the relevant IPs that you want to talk with your application, and so on. And really, those vulnerabilities, going back to the metaphor that we had about the open door, really those vulnerabilities, if they're exploited, they can cause reputational and financial damage. So if we just look at the example on the slide, we have an EC2 workload with potential that can be accessible from the internet, can have really any kind of the vulnerabilities that we spoke earlier on, that could eventually allow an attacker to access your sensitive data. And this is why you want to work to monitor and proactively react to vulnerabilities before they even become a threat. Because the second they become an active threat and someone can access that data, there would have already been a reputational or financial damage to your organization. There are many tools within AWS that you can use in order to monitor and get visibility into all of those different kinds of vulnerabilities. But the main two ones, when we think about that, are Security Hub and Amazon Inspector. So I'll go over them one by one to give the background, and from there I'll let my colleagues from NatWest speak. So on Security Hub really has two main value propositions. The first one that relates the most to our session today is that this is a cloud security posture management service that continuously monitors for configuration vulnerabilities, for misconfigurations. Security Hub has hundreds of different controls against more than 50 AWS services that continuously look for that kind of stuff. And most of those controls are actually change-based. So you are alerted of a configuration vulnerability within minutes after it occurs. The second value proposition that Security Hub has, as per its name, it's a hub. And with Security Hub being a hub, it collects findings from dozens of partner products. It shows them in a single organization account in a single region, providing you a single pane of glass, and normalizes them into a single finding format to really give you a single place to respond and to start the remediation process for the findings that are being surfaced. So maybe to take you through how findings really flow into Security Hub, To my point from earlier on, there are really two types of findings that go into Security Hub all in the same format. The first type are from our CSPM checks, from our Cloud Security Posture Management checks. And those checks are categorized into standards that are aligned with specific regulatory frameworks, such as the payment card industry data security standard, such as frameworks from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and such as the AWS Foundation benchmark framework from the Center for Internet Security. However, the main standard in Security Hub is the AWS Foundation Security Best Practices, and that standard contains more than 300 controls, and I'll speak about what controls are in a second, against more than 50 AWS services that have been vetted and approved by AWS security experts to be the best practice in terms of configurations that should be used within AWS services. Controls, to my point from earlier on, is any type of check within the CSPM part of Security Hub. So for example, a specific type of misconfiguration against a specific resource type. The second types of findings that come into Security Hub are from all of our integrations. And we have more than 60 partner integrations that send findings to Security Hub. And these are Inspector, which I'll talk about soon. This is from GuardDuty and Config and Macie and Firewall Manager and other AWS services. But we also integrate with dozens of external partner services. You can see Qualys and CrowdStrike on the screen, but there are many more. All of those flow into Security Hub, get translated into the same finding format called ASFF, the AWS Security Finding Format, and then are collected within Security Hub if you're using the organization integration within a single account in a single region. Whenever a new or updated finding comes in, a trigger or notification is being sent to EventBridge, allowing you to act on it immediately and really build any flows that you want. This can be from taking some actions on those findings to remediate or to respond through Lambdas and System Managers Runbook and step functions and so on. This can be through additional partner integrations that take our findings and allow you to respond them, from ticketing system to even Slack, which will send you a message for each finding, or you can set filters in EventBridge to only notify you on critical findings, for example. And finally, we also have built-in integrations with other AWS services, Audit Manager for compliance, Detective for investigations, and so on. Diving deep into some of those capabilities, obviously the Cloud Security Posture Management is what we've come to discuss today. And this allows you to monitor for the configuration vulnerabilities. And really what you can see is that for each of the frameworks, each of the standards that we've discussed, Security Hub provides you an overview, including a score, showing how much you comply with that standard, and as well as individual breakdown of those controls within the standard to show you which one has passed, which one has failed, what's the breakdown of the passed versus failed resources, and so on. Really giving you easy visibility into your security posture in terms of configuration. To decide which standards and controls you want to use, there is a simple two-step process that was launched a couple of months ago at reInvent last year that allows you to decide which standards and controls you want, deploy them either to your entire organization, to specific accounts, or to specific organizational units directly from the administrator account, and apply them together at all of the AWS regions that you're using. Meaning that the administrator account in the home region for Security Hub that you use, this is the main region where all of the findings are shown, can also be used for configuring Security Hub and the Cloud Security Posture Management checks that we have, really giving you a single pane of glass, not just for visibility, but also for configuration. And speaking of visibility, each finding that comes into Security Hub, regardless of whether it comes from the CSPM controls or whether it comes from one of our external integration, is enriched with consistent context, such as account name and account owner information, resource tags, AWS application information, really allowing you to use those metadata, filter based on them, search based on them, build your own custom dashboards within Security Hub based on them, and build actions based on them to remediate or to respond once again. This capability also allows you to respond and remediate to findings quickly. AWS offers what we call the Automated Security Response Solution, which is a set of more than 100 runbooks that have been already created for you, allowing you to take either one-click remediative actions for CSPM controls or automated remediative actions for CSPM controls. This is free of charge on top of Security Hub. You can create automation rules that are rules that use the same context that we have enriched from earlier on and really allows you to take action on it and add additional business context to each new finding that comes from Security Hub. So for example, you can create a rule that says, hey, all findings that come from that specific business unit are automatically elevated to critical because it has sensitive workloads. So automation rules allows you to do that within Security Hub without any code. You can create custom actions within Security Hub that trigger a Lambda or trigger a systems manager runbook, the same that we discussed earlier on, to really allow you to take automated actions after you see a finding and decide you want to act on it. And as part of our integrations, we also have the ticketing and workflow tools such as Jira or ServiceNow that really allow you to act on those findings and notify the relevant stakeholders on those findings. Now, this was a high-level overview of Security Hub, and as you can see, it's not just a CSPM. There is a lot more to it. But still, so far we've only discussed the first type of vulnerabilities from earlier on, the configuration vulnerabilities. For software and code vulnerabilities, we have Amazon Inspector, which to my point from earlier on also integrates with Security Hub, really providing you a single place of visibility for all of your vulnerabilities. But you can also use Inspector separately if you want to. And really what it does is that it monitors both for software and code vulnerabilities. And in addition to that, it also tells you about unintended network exposure. So if you remember the diagram that I had very early in the session with the EC2 instance with vulnerabilities that's connected to the internet, not just the information about the software and code vulnerabilities, but also the information about the internet connectivity comes from Inspector. Specifically, a couple of important capabilities that Inspector has. It offers what we call hybrid scanning of instances. So traditionally, the way to scan vulnerabilities on instances has been through an agent. AWS offers the systems manager agent that's installed by default on most EC2 instances type, giving you easy visibility into most of your instances type. But there are a couple of instances on which the agent cannot be installed because of regulatory requirements or because of they're just from a version that do not support the agent. And in that respect, Inspector also offers, and this was also launched recently, an agentless approach that could be used to scan those instances. And furthermore, Inspector has a hybrid mode that automatically chooses between the agent or the agentless approach, depending on whether the agent is installed or not, really giving you the flexibility that you need in order to scan vulnerabilities and have whatever you want running on your instance. And finally, we've spoken about software versus code vulnerabilities. You can see on the left side, on the board, two types of findings that come from Inspector for a Lambda function. On the left-hand side, we are seeing a software vulnerability, a vulnerability in a package being used by the function. On the right-hand side, you can actually see the code vulnerability, if we have the code, pointing to the relevant line in the code where the vulnerability is. So in this case, it's a socket bind that really will accept communication from all IP addresses. So Inspector really gives you the visibility both into software vulnerabilities as well as code vulnerabilities. With that introduction into our product, I would like to give the stage to my dear friend and actually the star of the show, Kenny, to discuss how NatWest has been onboarding and using those services. Thanks very much.
All right. Thanks very much, Gail.
Remember to talk.
Can everybody hear me okay? Fantastic. Thank you. So I'm Kenny Dunn. I'm the product owner for cloud controls at NatWest Group in the UK. Many of you won't have heard of NatWest, maybe, but we used to own Citizens Bank in the US up until 2015. So NatWest is one of the 4 major financial services organizations in the UK. We've been around for nearly 300 years. We were first chartered in 1727. And my fun fact for the day, in 1728, we invented the overdraft and we handed out the first one. We serve around 19 million customers in every region of the UK. And we're actually multiple companies under one umbrella. So you can see here some of the brands on screen, and you can see also similarities with the Citizens brand. We process 1 in 4 payments in the UK, and we are key to the UK economy. We're increasingly being seen as a digital bank, especially in retail banking, where 96% of our transactions, our retail transactions, are completed through digital channels. So, the bank has been on a cloud journey for a few years now. And very recently, we have chosen to adopt AWS Security Hub and Amazon Inspector into our suite of security controls. I want to chat through that journey in adopting those tools, and I hope that it will maybe resonate with some of you who are on a similar journey. So I'm going to talk through the pain points we were seeing in our cloud journey, the decision making we took when we were going to adopt these tools, what we did when we set up the tools, and what we configured after they were enabled. And finally, hopefully, I'll give you some key takeaways that you can take back and smooth out your own journey. So NatWest was like many companies. We've been around for a long time, and we had our traditional on-premise data centers where we ran our applications, our servers. In 2017 or thereabouts, we moved a small number of applications over to public cloud. We wanted to start to understand what it was like to operate in public cloud, both as a technology shop and as a business. And we continue to move workloads to this day over to public cloud based on their suitability. But we do have a big investment in our own data centers, and we don't think that every application is suitable for public cloud. So we'll continue to work in a hybrid mode in the future, a hybrid model. We have a suite of security tools that we use to manage our on-premise data centers. And as we moved to public cloud, we had to adapt and start to think about the nuances and the opportunities that secure in public cloud brought. And I want to talk about a couple of journeys, one around adopting a CSPM or controls, and the other one about adopting a vulnerability management tool. So starting on the controls journey, when we first put our first few applications into public cloud, we had tens of accounts, and we looked out to the market. We're a financial services organization. Controls are at the forefront of our thoughts, and so we looked for an off-the-shelf product that we could just bring in and apply controls to our accounts. All we found at the time was open source projects, which were great, but not something that we were willing to bring into the bank. Like many companies at the time, we started to build our own in-house controls. And we used Amazon's tools such as Config and Lambda and others to build that set of controls. The controls are mostly detective, and we based the work on the CIS benchmarks that Gal had just mentioned, as well as our own internal frameworks for controls. As we moved from tens of accounts into hundreds of accounts and we started to move more applications across, being a financial services company, we have strict change control. And so as the number of accounts grew, trying to get those controls out onto the accounts, the complexity grew. We changed the way of deploying the controls into a self-service tool using infrastructure as code. And that allowed the application teams to integrate the control upgrades, the new controls, into their own route to live. Now this took us from a handful of accounts into hundreds of accounts. And using the infrastructure as code allows us to deploy the controls in a consistent manner across the accounts. And we also started to look at building more and more corrective controls in the automation that Gal was talking about. But at the time, the acronym CSPM had started to become known, a Cloud Security Posture Manager. And we thought, well, that's what we're doing in the bank. And it's not something we're in the business of doing. We're in the business of building financial services. So we went again and we looked to market to see if there's anything we could onboard. So as we move towards 1,000 accounts, we adopted a cloud-agnostic cloud security posture manager that wasn't Amazon's. And it worked great. It provided us with the detective controls that we could use, and we could start to concentrate on corrective and preventative measures. But as we were increasing in size, we started to see some issues. So firstly, although we had detective controls based on the frameworks that were in this third-party agnostic tool, cloud agnostic tool, we still had to keep up with the controls. Because we were building our own corrective controls, we still had to have those detective controls in AWS or have a convoluted method for triggering it from the third party. We also had a problem with the cost with the third party. It was quite expensive, and the more we grew in the organization, the more that was difficult to keep up with. And being an external to AWS, the third party was constantly putting API calls into our environments, into all of our accounts. And like most companies, we have centralized logging, and so we're having a giant bloat in the logs that we were seeing. And some of the account owners and the application teams who use CloudTrail were struggling with this volume of logs that were being generated by these API calls. On the vulnerability management side, the journey is slightly different. We started with thousands of servers on-premise, and we used the standard model of putting agents on the servers, and then those agents would talk back to central management tools that were in our data centers, and that were great. We baked the agents into our golden images, their builds, and where we couldn't use builds, we would make sure the agents are installed, and that gave us the coverage we were looking for. When we moved into public cloud, and again, just dipping our toe in the water and had tens of servers over there, then using that same model, I guess that was a thing that many of us did. We tried something on-premise and we moved to public cloud and we would try the same thing. And it worked okay. We took the agent and we baked it into our AMIs. And where we couldn't use our golden source or our golden AMIs, we would make sure we had the agents on the servers. And by that time, we had switched out to a SaaS service on the internet for our central management. And we had to make sure that we had connectivity back to that service. And it worked fine. Until we started moving towards thousands of servers in the cloud, along with our thousands of servers on-premise. And the model became really quite difficult and time-consuming to maintain our coverage. So the pain points for vulnerability management really were, keeping that agent up to date and keeping it in the build, making sure people were reusing the builds that we were passing out. The connectivity became a problem. We were having to make sure we had connectivity from every agent out to the internet. And a lot of the time we were building, private VPCs that we didn't want to have any of that in place. And having that over hundreds of accounts really was difficult. And so just in general, the coverage was becoming more and more difficult to deal with, or to achieve, sorry. And for both controls and vulnerability management, there were some common pain points that we had. Firstly, democratizing the findings out to the account owners. So when we were passing the alerts back to central consoles that were owned by our security teams, we then had to either provide access into those external consoles, or I'll give them a minute. So access into those central consoles, or we would produce reports and pass them out, but there's a bit of a delay in that, or fire tickets into our incident system. But what we really wanted is to have these findings sitting with the account owners. That's what we're looking for. We also had centralized costs. The security team was the one that was putting in these applications, these central consoles, and paying for this. And then it's difficult to get a real total cost of ownership for applications and the resources that they were using. I pointed before around the difficulty to automate the corrections. We're having to duplicate controls or have some trigger coming from the external. And finally, for both the application teams and the security teams, you're having multiple consoles to try and see what your security posture was across your application account or the organization as a whole. So we decided at that time that we were going to rethink and what did we want to have out of our CSPM and our vulnerability management. So we wanted to see a reduction in the cost, and we also wanted to see that decentralization, make sure that people were paying for what they were using. We wanted controls frameworks that we were going to adopt as an organization or had adopted that meant that the detective controls were all just taken care of and we didn't have to spend any time on that. We wanted to have a simple way of automating responses. We wanted our critical findings to have immediate actions on them. We didn't want to wait for people to respond to the incidents. Oh, it's gone backwards. And we wanted to see a reduction in the logging and a reduction indirectly in the costs that we were seeing in CloudTrail. And finally, and I'll say this a number of times, we wanted to democratize that visibility, have those findings out with the people who can actually make a difference and get fixing. On the vulnerability management side, it's a similar story. The cost decentralization, the total cost of ownership, the automation of responses, and the democratized visibility. But we also wanted to have connection simplicity. I didn't want to have convoluted ways of allowing these agents to talk out to the central consoles. And I just wanted the easiest possible way of having, complete coverage for our estate. And for both the security teams and the application teams, we wanted to have a single pane of glass. Again, Gal mentioned this earlier on. So as an organization, we use a number of tools, and we wanted to have one place that we can go to see what our posture was. So that was something key for when we were moving forward in our decision. So we did go to market, and we did try a number of things, and no surprises here. The things that we chose, the tools that we chose were Amazon Inspector and AWS Security Hub. Really, with all the requirements that we had, it was the only solutions that were able to satisfy our requirements. So next I want to look into actually what we did when we set up the tools. So I came from an on-premise data center background, and so working with public cloud is quite refreshing for me. And just, the decision for our organization from deciding that we want to go with the tools to actually implementing them only took 30 days. Now, for some of y'all in startups or other companies, 30 days might seem like a long time, but financial services company, that is pretty quick. And if we didn't work for a regulated organization with a lot of strict change control, then really we could do this in a day. It's a fairly simple task. You're enabling Security Hub and Inspector at the organization. We're delegating out to a delegated account, a delegated admin account. And I'd recommend, if you're doing that and using many of Amazon's tools, that you use the same delegated admin account. It makes the integration into Security Hub seamless. And we did this all through Terraform. We're an infrastructure as code organization. But equally, you could do this through CloudFormation or using the central configuration console as well. We also aggregated all of our regions up into one region, again, looking for that single pane of glass. And one thing I'd like to say just around the journey was the support that we got from Amazon was fantastic. I don't know why that slide didn't go. Anyway, normally when I go to use or bring on a new product, I would be starting with a sales team of people who'd want to sell me everything around the features of the product. But with Amazon, when we talked to our TAM, the first person I talked to was Gal, and we started talking about what it meant to actually implement the tool. And then we started talking with Greg and with Gal, and started to talk about what the roadmap was for Security Hub and what the features were that were coming. The support was really fantastic. And AWS aren't a perfect organization, but they're really willing to learn from their customers, and Gal and Greg are constantly looking for feedback from us to see what else we want to see in the product. So I guess we've turned on the tool, and that is pretty much the story over, although it's not. Really, once you've turned on these tools, it's where the hard work begins. And I just want to talk about what we saw after we turned it on. And I'll start with some good things. We turned it on, and on Security Hub, we got immediate coverage, 100% for our accounts. Inspector was a similar story, although Inspector is still an agent-based tool at the time. We needed the SSM agent on the EC2 instances. So we actually turned it on, and we got around about 80% coverage for Inspector. Luckily at the time, Amazon had just released hybrid mode. Again, Gal's mentioned that previously. And we turned that on. And that, we could get the EC2 instances that didn't have the SSM agent. And we actually hit 98% coverage. And for clicking a couple of buttons, that was a fantastic story from our side. The next thing that I saw, which was quite interesting, and one thing I actually didn't talk about, was when we were going through the process of enabling Security Hub and Inspector, we used the estimation tools that are provided by Amazon to try and get an idea of what it was going to cost us in the future. We were quite happy with what that was going to, or was indicating, but we still weren't sure, so we utilized the trial periods. So I think it's 30 days for Security Hub and 15 days for Inspector, and that gave us an accurate view. But actually at the time we just dipped our toe in the water. We enabled it for 10 accounts, and we were talking to our customers the whole time, our internal customers, our application teams. We let them know that this was coming, and actually a bunch of the teams got back in touch and said, can you just add us in to the test? We want to get this on our accounts as well. So that was the reaction before we'd even turned this on, and once we turned it on, we saw a fantastic reaction from the teams as well. Again, putting the findings in the hands of the teams meant that they were just picking these up and starting to fix them straight away, and there was no delay having to go through security or check a console or wait for these to come through. So as an organization, we have a faster response time, and we're also reducing risk for the organization. We also saw the cost reduction we expected. So the cost reduction the cost in total was about 10%, within 10% of the estimation that we did originally. And we saw the cost reduction that we were hoping for. It was significantly cheaper than the CSPM that we were using. And also we had this distribution of the costs amongst the teams, so the teams are now more aware of what they were spending in building their applications. But after all that, we turned this on, and we're a fair size of organization. We have hundreds of accounts, and we use a number of the tools that Gal had up on screen, and they all flow into Security Hub. And we have this all coming into a central account and all aggregated regions. And so you can imagine that we were quite overwhelmed centrally with the data that we had there. So I want to talk now about how we dealt with the noise that was created so we could start to pick out the important findings and start to work on them. Now I know that the consolidated findings feature of Security Hub is now on by default, but at the time it wasn't for us. And Gal has told me that some customers still haven't turned this on, so I'm still going to talk about it. As an organization, we adopted more than one control framework within Security Hub, and without the consolidated findings switch on, there is duplication across those frameworks. An example being having MFA on your root user. You'll find that in every single framework. So if you've turned on more than one, let's say 3 of the frameworks you're using for your controls, they would come in as 3 separate findings. Turning on consolidated findings turns that into a single finding for that particular one, and just reducing some of the noise. So if you've not done that, I'd recommend. The next thing we did is to look through all of the control standards that we had adopted and make sure that we agreed that these are things that we want to see as an organization. So there is the ability to suppress findings at the organization level or at the central console level. And there was a couple in there that we didn't agree with, and so as an organization we suppressed them for everyone. And that meant they were removed again from the accounts at the account level. So again, reducing a bit of noise. One thing I think we did as an organization was turn these tools on a bit too quickly, in quick succession, and maybe overwhelmed the teams and the central teams with all these different findings coming in. They didn't manage to get settled with Security Hub findings before Inspector was turned on. So if you are using these tools and maybe turning on other things like Macy or Guard Duty or other tools, maybe staggering and giving the teams time to adjust before the next tool is enabled. Nagao talked about tuning or talked about the automations feature. When we were going through the control standards, as well as looking for things that we would maybe suppress, we were also looking at finding severities that we didn't agree with. Now, our organization has zero tolerance for public-facing resources like EC2 instances or S3 buckets. And we found that some of the standards brought them out as medium or even high, but we see them as critical findings. And so we used automations to tune these particular findings and turn them from high to critical or medium to critical, so that as an organization we see them at the right level. So it's very useful. And again, it's this golden source of information. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. When we were going through the suppression of findings as well, one thing we did note is that at some points we would pick one of the finding types out, and let's say resilience. There's many findings on resilience. And we'd say, well, that's something that's really important in production, but it's not important in our sandpit environments. And it'd be great if we could disable it in sandpit, but allow it in production or in test. And so configuration policies is a feature that allows you to do that. And what we do as an organization is we have an organization structure in OUs that take us from our dev environments, our sandpit environments through dev, test, and production. And our accounts are put into those OUs. And then we've built configuration policies that suppress findings that we don't need at these different environment levels, and we apply it to them. And that means that we're again reducing noise, especially in the lower environments. So even after all of your noise reduction, all the actions you can take, you still need to fix some issues. First of all, I would look for some low-hanging fruit that you can fix quickly. In our case, when we turned on Inspector, we got a huge number of findings around ECR images. And it turned out that what our development teams were doing were good practice in constantly updating their images, making sure they were removing any vulnerabilities, but we weren't deleting the old images that weren't being used anymore. And so there was a lot of ECR findings. So we deleted them all, turned on ECR lifecycle, and that allowed us to remove quite a number of findings from there. So the other thing we would suggest doing, and what we did, was to create runbooks for common issues that we saw. And that would allow the security teams and the application teams to be able to react as quickly as possible. Now, we also want to turn those runbooks into automation, because it's the fastest way that you can fix issues. So we've got a rather simplified diagram up here, but Security Hub flows its findings into EventBridge, and then you can put in EventBridge rules that can pick up finding types that you're interested in. And then we use Lambda or AWS System Manager documents to automate responses to those and fix the resources as required. And again, an example, the EC2 instance that somehow somebody managed to make public, we would have automation in place to shut that machine down, remove the public IP address, and we nicely tag the machine as well to let the account owner know that that had been shut down, why, and we give them a little link for instructions on what they should be doing. I talked before at the beginning of the chat that we are a fairly complex organization with lots of different business levels. So we call the business areas domains, and within those domains we have application teams have accounts, and we wanted to see our Security Hub findings with context that is our organization. And so we did try to use Security Hub. They have great visualizations through insights. But when it came to our own business context, we found it a bit difficult. So we looked to enhance what was there and using more Amazon tools. So we have Lambda functions that grab the findings from Security Hub and we enrich it with our own company context and then present it to both security and the application teams through Amazon QuickSight. And it allows them to delve into the findings in lots of different ways. So very useful. And the final thing isn't really a diagram on something that we've done. It's more highlighting again the idea of the golden source. So when we put this in place and we start to connect up to our existing security tools, we were going to connect it into our SIM and we're having a discussion with the security team. And they spotted a finding coming in that was high and they said, oh, that's something we could change in the SIM to critical. And so I was saying, well, that would be good, but that means that the security team are expecting to operate a critical response to that, whereas the application team would still see that as high and would be responding appropriately for that severity. So we agreed that the golden source is Security Hub, and back to those automations, we'll use automations and make those changes at Security Hub so everyone sees them as critical and it's common across everyone. And that's me almost at the end. What's next for our company? Well, we're going to continue. We have a big backlog of corrective controls that we're just going to keep hammering through. As we're creating those corrective controls, because we're infrastructure as code, we also create a preventative control at the same time. We're trying to shift left that security so that developers, when they're committing code or deploying, they're starting to see the responses there and then. And really, the key is because we have some of the detective controls covered by Security Hub and Inspector, then we're just looking to try and enable these developers and make it as easy as possible for them to be secure. So I'll quickly run through the key takeaways. The first thing I want to say is that it was a success. For us, it was easy to turn on both of these tools. The coverage was great right from the off, and it gave us a fantastic view of the posture of our organization. The teams are empowered. They have the findings at their hands, and they are, as I say, getting fixing. And the other services that are integrating into that are providing us with a single pane of glass. So it's been great. However, there are pain points, and I wish if we'd gone back, there's a few things that we would have maybe done that I've talked about before we actually turn these things on or take them to production. So don't underestimate the work. Make sure that you're prepared. Look at the noise reduction suggestions that I had there. Look at what you could do to put in automations to your responses, and really see how you can integrate these with your existing processes and tools in the security teams. Make sure you're communicating with your customers, let them know what's happening, really get to know them, understand your stakeholders, what tools they're going to be using and why. And really the next thing is making sure that there's training in place for your customers. And now I'm going to hand over to Greg, who's going to talk through what AWS did with NatWest to help us on our journey. So thank you. There you go.
Excellent. Hello everyone, can I get a quick thumbs up to make sure you can all hear me okay? Super. Okay, I'll start with a quick apology. I managed to pick up a sore throat on the flight, so if I cough down the mic during the presentation, I apologise for that. Thank you to Kenny for sharing the NatWest story. What I'm going to do is map those key takeaways that he shared at the end onto an approach for enabling an organisational wide service such as Security Hub. Okay, so as an account solution architect, it's my job to help our customers onboard and consume AWS. So services such as Security Hub and Inspector have what we would describe as an organisational wide scope. And by that we mean in order for the services to operate efficiently and effectively, it's going to require collaboration across many different departments of your organisation working together. So for example, you'll have security teams working closely with the AWS platform owners who are responsible for managing and maintaining the AWS landing zone, working with cloud application teams responsible for deploying applications into individual AWS accounts. So because of this, enabling such a service is going to require a coordinated and a managed effort across your organization, and that can often be really challenging just to get started with. So what I'll do over the coming slides is I'll talk you through the approach that we followed at NatWest. I'll share with you how we, AWS, were able to help them, and also share what we believe to be best practices, with the goal of simplifying your journey and making it an easier one if you decide to follow a similar path. Okay, so step one. Step one is to engage your AWS account team, right? So we're here to act as a conduit to our service teams and specialists such as Gal. We're more than happy to coordinate and run deep dive sessions for dedicated audiences for you. This will provide you with the opportunity to qualify your understandings of the service, relay your requirements to us, so that we can work together to work out if the service is the right one for your organization. Moving into step two, as with any large-scale service enablement, it's important to make sure you get the right teams and the right people involved, from the get-go. So at this early part, it's really important to nominate champions, both from the areas that are responsible for enabling the org-wide service, as well as those teams who are going to be interacting with it and looking at those filings on a day-to-day basis. So we have the opportunity here to deep dive again. So we can run. We have literally hundreds of service-specific workshops that we can run for you as immersion days. So we can, as an example, we have an excellent Security Hub workshop. We run that successfully for NatWest, over 120 staff. It provided them with the hands-on exposure to the services right at the start of their journey in an AWS-provided environment at no cost to themselves. Additionally, for those teams who are perhaps less experienced with AWS, we can provide Security 101 sessions, security fundamentals trainings. The point here being to familiarize them with the core concepts and terminology of AWS as they move through into the next phase of the journey. So this is step three. So step three is if the deep dives and the workshops have shown value to your organization, we look to move into a POC. So here we want to make sure that we start small and focused, but we think big in terms of our scope. So we all understand the value of running proof of concepts. For NatWest with Security Hub, the purpose was to get a base understanding of the controls and the findings that were relevant in their business context, but also those that were not relevant. So we're able to optimize that for them. If you're considering to do the same, I would recommend here you use the free trial that comes with the Security Hub. So it's a 30-day free trial. Start small in terms of the number of accounts, perhaps 5, 10, 20, depending on the size of your organization. But importantly, make sure that they come from diverse use cases. So what we want to do here is maximize the opportunity for you to understand what a wider enablement of Security Hub might look like in your organization, in terms of the quantity and the coverage of the findings, for example. If at any point you require assistance during this POC phase, again, engage with your AWS account team. We're more than happy to work with you directly and liaise with the account teams on your behalf. The service teams on your behalf. In step 4, we move into analysis. So we work with you, the customer, to analyze the results from the POC, to understand the security posture of the accounts that are actually in scope of the POC. The purpose here is that we're looking to build confidence around what that wider enablement might look like for your organization. It's also an opportunity for you to validate your expectations of the service. As part of this step, there are 2 other key areas that we can help with here. So firstly, it's linking back to Kenny's key takeaways around communication and the need for training. We need to listen to user experience feedback here. So during the POC, the short window of the POC, you may have identified some undesirable misconfigurations that need to be remediated straight away, and we can feed those back into the account owners associated with the POC accounts. Equally, the feedback may identify a greater need for education. So here we can lean in, deliver more training to you and your teams before considering enabling that service more widely. There's also a really valuable opportunity here for you to feed back into the AWS service teams. So NatWest have many different security functions across many different domains with lots of expertise. We've loved receiving their feedback because it allows us to continue to develop our services and features, and we've really appreciated that from NatWest. The second area is cost. So as Kenny mentioned, you can always use the public cost calculator to understand how our services are charged before going into the POC. But if you focus on the POC account, you get to see the charges associated with your account, your use cases and your environments. So that's really useful in terms of working out what costs might look like for you. We can lean in here, we can help you review and optimize and see what's appropriate to make sure we set things right for your organization. Just to clarify here, during the free trial, you're not obviously billed for the service, but you still have access to all of that metric information around costings, so you can get that really clear picture. Moving into step 5, we look to expand and validate. So if you are encouraged by the results of the POC, you can look to enable that 30-day free trial across your entire organization like NatWest did for hundreds of accounts. This is the right point as your confidence grows with the service to expand education as well. So let's look at rerunning those service-specific workshops, the immersion days, also the security fundamentals trainings, but this time for a much wider audience. We AWS can help with that. We also encourage customers to look beyond just the security fundamentals. So you can use our skill builder platform as NatWest did, to look to educate your security teams in some more of the foundational and fundamental AWS services. What this does is it helps them apply additional context to the findings that are being surfaced to them via the Security Hub dashboard, and it allowed them to curate runbooks associated with findings to speed up future investigations and resolutions. Additionally, when we're now at this midway point, with that organizational-wide coverage across all of your accounts, it'd be the right time to perform a comparison against your incumbent CSPM, if appropriate. You'll be able to perform assessments around to satisfy any required levels of coverage, feature parity, etc. Again, we're happy to be involved here as much as you require. Moving into step 6. So this is your decision point. So hopefully, once the trial concludes, we hope that the service will have exceeded all of your expectations and you continue in your adoption. So if that's the case, there's nothing more for you to do here. Once that free trial expires, you're simply moved into being billed. If at any point, however, you want to pause, you can do so via the delegated administrator account. A few clicks in the console, and you can disable Security Hub across the board for all of your accounts. At any time during that decision-making process, you can obviously engage us again. So here would be a great time to meet with the service teams again, have a conversation around the service roadmap perhaps to see what's coming down the line in future. Have those Q&A sessions again, so you can iron out or gain clarity over any final items you may be unsure of. Step 7. So step 7 is, if like NatWest you decide to continue with Security Hub, we reach this final step. And for me, this is arguably the most important. So the key point here is that not everybody in your application teams is going to understand security, and they won't understand the specific and unique security threats that face your organization. Equally, not everybody in your security teams will understand the complexities of running and deploying applications into the public cloud. So it's really important here that we identify ongoing champions to continue to seek that feedback. So it should come from all parties, and we're looking here to develop patterns and automations to seek to solve or mitigate the issues that are surfaced to you via the dashboard and Security Hub, to solve for those findings, helping to make your environments as safe and secure as they can be. So there are a couple of extra areas that we can help with in this final step. If you're really keen, straight after this session, we have a threat detection and response workshop where you'll get direct access to Security Hub and Inspector. I'll leave this up for a few seconds. You can check the room. Outside of Inforce, we have what's known as AWS Activation Days. So these are public workshops that provide customers with prescriptive guidance when enabling services inside their organizations. So this, for the centralized security activation day, we will cover topics such as container security, threat detection and response, vulnerability management, and many more topics delivered across time zones to suit the location of your teams. We then have AWS game days. So game days are always great fun, they're always entertaining, but they're really valuable when enabling organizational wide services such as Security Hub and Inspector. So we ran a game day for NatWest, taking another example. We ran a game day for them earlier this year to 50 staff members at NatWest, involving 10 teams of 5. Now, importantly, what we did here is we made sure that the teams were made up of 3 different personas. So again, we've got the security teams, we've got the platform owners, and we've got the cloud application teams. So here you have the sat around the same table, seeking to solve the questions, the challenges inside the game days. You've got the individuals responsible for protecting the organization, sitting alongside those team members who are responsible for building, scaling, maintaining the AWS landing zone, working closely with the cloud application teams whose job it is to fundamentally transform the way that the organization does business. So the conversations that we observed during the day were extremely valuable, both to us and to NatWest. So while solving these game day challenges, you could see conversations arising where they were discussing various approaches to resolving findings that were being surfaced to them via the tooling. Now, what seemed to be quite a trivial response to, or trivial resolution to a finding to somebody from within security operations actually turned out to be, complex and challenging to implement for application teams across all of their environments repeatably, and actually would have been solved far easier via a new platform control through something like a data perimeter control or a new pipeline control, for example. The key point here is to highlight is that by running these sessions, you're building that cross-functional understanding of each other's unique challenges, and that will help you build better, more efficient, pragmatic responses to resolving vulnerabilities for your organization, again, making your environments as safe as they can be. Okay, so finally, in summary today, I want to leave you with these 3 key takeaways. So Security Hub and Inspector provide you with that comprehensive protection against vulnerabilities in the cloud. Both have free trials. I'd encourage you to deep dive into those and take a look to see if you think they're initially right for your organization. Should you consider moving forward with the services, remember those takeaways shared to you by Kenny. So you've got the focus on preparation, focus on communication and training when enabling the org-wide services. And then finally, the key point from us at AWS is don't feel like you have to make this journey alone. Take advantage of the support that we offer to help accelerate your enablement of these services. So again, you're making your environment safer as quickly as you can. So with that, it's a thank you from me on behalf of Gal and I. Thank you to Kenny for joining us on stage, coming all the way over from Scotland. Really appreciate your time. What I would say is, please do reach out to us at the end of the session if you've got any specific questions. Come and approach us. We're more than happy to talk. Equally, we have a session survey, so we really appreciate it if you could complete the session survey and give us that feedback. Thank you very much, everyone.